About the time Charlemagne died, Europe was being hard hit by invaders from three places. From the Mediterranean world and from Spain, the Muslims were hitting. Spain was still, even after battle tours, Spain still had to fight the Muslims, as did France. The Muslims took over part of Sicily for a while. They were attacking the Mediterranean up, and they kept hitting places like southern France and Greece. The Magyars, another group from Central Asia. We've already talked about the Huns, the Magyars, the Bulgars, the Avars, and the Finns. All these people and some others who came in wave after wave from Mongolia and places near Mongolia. These nomadic peoples would come in. And then the Vikings, they were from Scandinavia. Now, if you think,
Scandinavia.
what's that?
Good old Scandinavia.
Yeah. Now, if you think that word Scandinavia sounds like the word scandal, there is a reason for that. The behavior of the Scandinavians oftentimes appeared to other people as being scandalous. Anyway, I'll leave that topic. All right, Vikings came to Scandinavia. Now, the Vikings would come down, swoop down. Eventually, the Magyars and the Vikings settled down. They became Christian. Normandy, the word Normandy means Northmen. The Vikings took a part of France called Normandy. And they also, well, the Normans took over a large part of England, but eventually Norman and Saxon learned to get along together. Vikings became Christian. The Magyars became Christian, and they blended in. The Muslims have not blended in to this day. The Muslim invaders. Europeans were able to hold them at bay, though. Now, again, this business folk of invaders coming in to your country, this is very applicable to today's news, what's going on today. So, mankind has always dealt with this. If you're an advanced civilization and you start to appear to be a little bit weak, or even if you have something that people want, like even a better life, outsiders will come in, but they often bring their own uncivilized ways with them. And the result is they have sometimes actually destroyed civilizations. So, serious matter. All right. Feudalism. We ran into this word before. Feudalism basically means you have a king who's usually just a figurehead. The real power resides with the nobles. Mostly the nobles. That's feudalism for you. A weak king who has very little authority, with the nobles having. Now, feudalism had been something like it had been practiced in Japan, and had been practiced in India. It basically, though, was never planned in Europe. But what would happen in Europe was, as these foreign invaders came in, weaker Europeans would ally themselves with stronger Europeans. So a man would approach someone rich and strong one day and said, I can't defend my family against all these invaders. Will you please help me? And the higher up in the system would say, okay, I will help you, and in turn I expect you to help me. So they would kneel down. The vassal would kneel down and place his hands inside the hands of the person he was swearing an oath of loyalty to. This oath of loyalty was called fealty. I hope I'm not confusing you, but basically the vassal would kneel and swear an oath of loyalty by putting his hands together, and the Lord would put his hands outside the hands of his vassal, and the vassal would swear an oath of fealty, that I will follow you wherever you go, I will fight your battles for you, And the Lord then would swear, the overlord would swear that I will protect you. And this was largely how the feudal system began. The feudal system was to last for hundreds of years in Europe, beginning around the year 900 or so, and lasting really till World War I. In other words, about 1,000 years. World War I did a lot to break up the power of the old nobility. In England, they broke it up already. In Germany and Austria, World War I broke the old nobility. And Russia, pretty much the same thing. The knights. The word knight means mounted horseman. Europeans bred bigger and larger horses by managing to figure out a way to crossbreed one type of horse with another and produce bigger horses. And now, to become a knight, you had to be of noble birth. And of course, you had to be able to afford to buy your own armor, your own swords, your own spears. The knights dominated the battlefields for Europe for some 500 years. Knights went out of existence when the English started using two weapons. The longbow, if you don't know anything about archery, the longbow is about 6 or 7 feet long, and it can penetrate a knight's shield and armor. But even more wicked than the longbow is the crossbow. The crossbow has to be cocked with a mechanical device, and when it's shot like a gun, you pull a trigger and it shoots the arrow. Now, how many of you know what I'm talking about? All right, okay, good. And a crossbow shoots with power. I mean, it's much more power than you can get with an ordinary bow and a bowstring. They're really, really tough. The crossbow also could penetrate a knight's armor and a knight's shield. Then gunpowder also came along, and they put the armored knight out of existence. But to become a knight, you had to be of noble birth. When you were 6, you became a page boy to your lord or to your king. At 14, you became a squire. As a squire, you learned how to hunt and handle weapons. Again, in Europe, only the privileged could hunt. And then at 21, if you weren't kicked out, you became a knight. Generally, the ceremony involved spending a whole night in prayer, and the next day after you spent a night in prayer, you would be dubbed a knight by your lord or by the king. The knights went by a code called chivalry. Chivalry was the way a knight dealt with his ladies. A knight was expected to treat the ladies with courtesy and respect. Now, it's understood that a knight usually only treated ladies of his own class, the upper classes, with courtesy and respect, not necessarily the lower classes. But now, a lot of persons have believed that this code of chivalry was one of the things that put Europe ahead of the other places in the world. I mean, after all, if you look at the way women were treated, under Islam, women were property to be treated like they were owned by the men. In China, females were often killed. They had their feet bound to keep them subservient. If they, in time of famine, the females were often killed. In India, same thing, except no foot binding, but the female who were considered a liability were often killed. In Europe, this did not go on. In Europe, there was a code that women were to be treated with honor and respect. Subservient, yes, but respected also. Now, the issue comes up now, is chivalry dead? Perhaps in today's world it is. Chivalry went spread in the modern world, and at one time it required that the man pay when he takes his date out to the restaurant or takes his date out in an event. All right. On a personal note, folks, back in 1987, I asked a girl this is before, but I asked a girl to go with me to Stone Mountain. When I got to Stone Mountain, she was shocked to learn you had to pay to get in. Well, of course, I knew it, so I pulled out my wallet and started to pay. She pulled out her pocketbook and started to pay her share. I said, hey, no, wait a minute. I knew this was going to cost money when I invited you in here. Here was a problem. She was unemployed, had been unemployed for weeks. I had been working at Lockheed for 7 years. I was in excellent shape financially, but she insisted she pay her way. When it came time for the meal, she insisted she pay her half. I went to Lockheed the next day and discussed this, and one of the young men who was unmarried said, yeah, my dates do me that way too, and I don't like it either. But the impression I got from this young woman was she was telling me, I'm not your girl, I'm never going to be your girl. Each of you can determine for yourself what you think.
Where'd the money come from, though? She was
all right, she wasn't working, but her father was a medical doctor, so that's where. Yeah, her father was an MD, and anyway, and he was keeping her going, but she didn't have a lot. But anyway, all right. Last account I had of her, she never had married. I don't know if she ever did. I lost track of her after a while. I was married more than a year later. All right, leaving that. Anyway, the nobility, you had various ranks. At the top were the kings. They could be compared to the president. Under the kings were dukes. Your dukes could be compared to governors. Like if we lived under the feudal system, there'd be a Duke of Georgia, a Duke of Alabama, a Duke of Tennessee, Duke of South Carolina. The dukes were like the governors. Then the counts, they were over the counties, of course, the word count, and there'd be a Count de Cab, Count of Cobb, Count Fulton, and whatever, I'm naming some of the counties we have in this area. The Count of Cobb of Cobb County. There'd be the counts ruling over the counties. And there'd be the knights. Now, oftentimes, let's say a count would have 2 or 3 sons. The oldest son he'd groom to be a count. Both sons he'd groom to be knights. I say both. Let's say he had 3 sons. The first 2 he might groom to be a count. The first one, the second one, and the first one to be knights, because the first is now the third son. You might say, what happened to him? He would go serve his church in some capacity as maybe a bishop or some high-ranking church official, provided he wanted to. But again, because the church insisted on celibacy, the new churchmen had to come from the ranks of the laity. The laity provided the officials for the church. There also are ranks of earl, marquis, viscount, etc., etc. The knights would engage in tournaments. Now, they tell me it's still going on, but when I first got married, I went to the Renaissance Festival, and at the Renaissance Festival they had knights engage in tournaments. And the tournaments where the knights in armor would gallop at full speed toward each other and try to knock each other off a horse. If any of you have been to Renaissance 2000, the persons tell me that festival is still going on. But the tournaments would oftentimes cripple a knight. I mean, falling off a horse in full armor folk is a serious matter. And a lot of times kings realized that this was really hurting armies. So they would, eventually the tournaments got safer and safer. Instead of using a spear, they'd use a spear with a ball point instead of a point. Instead of a point, the spear would end in a ball. And then they got to where that they would just simply bang each other without knocking each other off the horse. Now again, this was to keep the armies from getting weaker. Now, the women. Women in the Middle Ages in Europe were expected to be subservient. Again, the code of chivalry helped guarantee that someone would be treated well. Now, that doesn't mean that every man treated his wife in a top quality. If you actually study the records, wife beating was a problem. It went on a lot during the Middle Ages. And a lot of that was brought on by drinking. Everybody in Europe in the Middle Ages drank, with maybe a few exceptions, and drank heavily, owing in part to the fact that the water was very polluted and unsafe to drink. So they would drink ale, and they had a lot of accidents owing to the fact that the ale made them take risks that they otherwise wouldn't take. And they got into a lot of fights again over the fact that they all lowered their inhibitions and made them do things that they would not do if they were more sober. All right. The most famous woman of the time was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, because life was short, a lot of your nobles did not have sons. So sometimes if a man didn't have a son, he could pass his title on to his daughter. Well, in the case of Eleanor, her father was the Duke of Aquitaine. She had no brothers. So when her father died, she inherited her father's estate and she became Duchess of Aquitaine. The Dukedom of Aquitaine was as big as the king's domain, so the king got his son to marry Eleanor. That way, when the king died, his son got, his son inherited his throne, his father's throne, and he got Eleanor's domains also as his, because he was married to Eleanor. The marriage did not work. The king's name was Louis VII. Louis VII went on a crusade, crusade number 2. And everybody thought this crusade would be a success because it was led by a king. This king carried his wife Eleanor with him and carried about 50 other women with him, and the result was disastrous. These women, I mean, we're all adults, they would hop around from man to man, including Eleanor herself. King Louis finally divorced Eleanor on grounds of an affair with her uncle, whether it was true or not. She probably had numerous affairs anyway. I mean, everybody pretty well knew it. The king finally divorced her. And also, he divorced her for a couple of other reasons. One was consanguinity. Meant that he felt like he was too closely related to her. She was a distant cousin.
Oh.
Yeah, so that, and also, now catch this close, folks, she bore him no male children. In other words, she had about 3 or 4 daughters, she had daughters only. And everybody in her day thought, well, see, she's a woman with no brothers, therefore she can only produce female babies. Today we know the fallacy of this logic, but she never produced a male baby, and of course she was blamed. These kings would oftentimes marry a woman who had a lot of brothers, believing that a woman who had a lot of brothers might be more likely to produce a male. Now today we look on that as being bogus. Well, Eleanor left her husband, which meant that he had half of his domains taken away. She married the King of England, Henry II, and she bore Henry II 4 sons. 2 of them became kings, King Richard the Lion-Hearted and King John. But anyway, we now believe, for those of you who don't know your biology, that it's the father who determines the sex of the child and not the mother. Some of you might have learned this in biology class. The fact that Eleanor had no brothers had nothing at all to do with it. She could not bear her first husband, the male heir. Now, as for King, the King of France, whom she married the first time, he married a different woman and he had 1 son. We'll talk about him later. His son was Philip Augustus. Anyway, now Eleanor is believed by some to be the father of romance, and don't write this down, this is something I just throw in. The romance scene that she supposedly got started was to wind up in Paris and wind up in the court of Versailles in France, and then spread on to Hollywood in the United States. It's the idea, now folks, don't take me out of context on this. What I'm about to say is something I absolutely do not believe. But that love is only a feeling you have, it's an emotion you have for someone, and eventually that feeling will go. When the feeling goes, you go too. You follow where your feelings lead you. And folk, the Hollywood scene, the last time I checked, 90% of your Hollywood marriages failed. Now there were a few that didn't. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans stayed together. Gene Autry stayed together with his wife. You might think of a few others who lived for a long time and stayed with their original spouse. But it's pretty rare that a Hollywood marriage works. And again, they jump around like Eleanor did from one man to another, following where their emotions lead. All right. So much for Eleanor and the idea of romance. At the Palace of Versailles in the 14, 15, 16, and 1700s, the same thing went on. All right. Moving on now to these countries. We'll start with 4 different nations we'll talk about in the Middle Ages. England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Russia. England. In England, the kings were more powerful than they were in France. They actually were kings. Now, folk, you might think I'm throwing a lot at you, but believe me, I took a course in medieval England when I was at UT, and we talked about every one of the kings that they had and what each one of them tried to do, and really we're only going to scratch the surface. I'm only going to mention 4 of them. The first one is William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror. All right. Now, William the Conqueror was the son of the Duke of Normandy. His father was a Northman. He was a Norman then. He was the son of the Duke of Normandy. And his father apparently was a sinful man. His father was known as Robert the Devil.